Hi everybody, and welcome to another video in the Understanding Station 11 series. And this one is a countdown really of 10 quotes that when I was reading through the text and writing the study guide, which is in the description if you'd like to buy that, I came across and I thought these are the things that the first time I'd read across them I'd think, oh yeah, not too much of, but the second and third and the fourth time that I read through them I thought there's so much here that's going on. And so this video is just about 10 quotes that are there in Station 11. They may not be the most obvious quotes. It's not going to be survival is insufficient and all of those other obvious ones that come to you, but rather it's going to be a list from 1 to 10 about quotes that really say more than what appears to be the first time that you read them. So let's jump in. Number 1. They are always waiting, the people of the undersea. They spend all their lives waiting for their lives to begin. So from page 86, we need to think about this line that Miranda includes. And there's so much that you can take from the parallel text that exists in that we have our reading of Station 11, but within that we have this Dr. 11 comic that is referred to so often. And it's up to you what you get out of it. I don't want you being stuck in this idea of thinking there is a certain interpretation of what the comics are and that's it. It is what you can get out of it. And so when I read this with this idea of they are always waiting, the people of the undersea, I understood that to be this idea of people that are really waiting for life to come to them, that the people that aren't actually making their lives what they would like it to be. And I could think of people such as Arthur and Clark. And Clark gets that Clark gets that opportunity where he's actually able to reflect on it. But if you think about Arthur, he's someone that is always looking for this purpose within his life. And honestly, I think it would be very optimistic of a reader to look at Arthur in his final days and goes, oh my goodness, how tragic. He just understood that he needed to go and be with his son and then he died on stage. I would take a more pessimistic reading of that and think that the idea that Arthur had to sell all his possessions and go to Jerusalem to be with Tyler was yet another idea that he followed. It was another avenue that he went down, like another relationship with his 3 failed marriages and all of these things that haven't brought him happiness. It seems to me that he has been waiting for his life to begin. And there is many different ways that you could see that. But I think that when it comes to understanding that intertextuality between what is going on with those Dr. 11 comics and thinking about what that might really mean for these people who are these iPhone zombies, these functioning sleepwalkers and so on, we start to think about people who really aren't there and in their own lives. They're these sleepwalkers, these people that are caught in the undersea or so on. And so what Mandel might be really getting across there is that there are all of these characters who can be summarized in this fashion where they're not quite there. It's always twilight on Station 11. So what does that mean about these characters in the real world and those people that aren't really defined in where they are or what their purpose might be? And so number 2 is a quote about Arthur that comes from when he is holding Tyler. And there are a few times where Mandel has talked about a certain moment and a certain frame in time. And so this is not unique in that fact, but it says on page 40 that Arthur is pictured carrying a small boy who beamed up at his father's face while Arthur smiled at the camera. And so the fact that they don't even mention Tyler by name, this idea that it was a small boy that was in his hands, leads to this interpretation of the inauthenticity of that moment for Arthur. That rather than focusing on what was right there in front of him, he was carrying his son physically at that time. And there was this small boy who beamed up at his father. And so that love and that affection for a father from the son was coming from Tyler looking up at Arthur. And what did Arthur choose to do in that moment? He chose to smile at the camera. And so what was more important to Arthur at that time was this idea of how he was perceived, how he would appear on camera, and this idea of what he could project. And what is so tragic about that clearly is that we understand Arthur by the end of his life to be someone that hasn't grasped what is right there in front of him. The love and the connection to other people that these other characters enjoy, and that purpose of their lives and what gives them joy and beauty in their life has not been grasped by Arthur. And I think in this one snapshot, and I use that word intentionally, because there is that idea that Mandel is saying, right, this was his snapshot in time where Tyler was staring up at Arthur and Arthur was instead focused on what the camera was doing, really signifies what it is that is so tragic about Arthur as a character, in that he can't see what is right there and what is genuine in front of him, but rather he is too focused on other things. So for number 3 of the quotes that have a little bit more meaning than perhaps we might have thought is the bouquet of lilies that Clark talks about in memory of his boyfriend Robert leaving him a bouquet of lilies on his desk. And the fact that that gets mentioned amongst the bouquet of corporate cliches that Clark and Garrett talk about shows that there is a clear difference between what is real and authentic and what is fake and what means nothing within a life. And this idea that Clark is actually there remembering these moments of these corporate cliches like circle back and shoot an email and all these types of things. And he and Garrett find some humor in it, but also some tragic desperation in the fact that that's what they concern their lives with. What Clark finds himself thinking of, rather than that bouquet of corporate cliches, is the bouquet of tiger lilies. And it's no accident that Mandel has used that same word bouquet to describe both of them, in that one of them describes all of these things that filled Clark's life for these last few years before the pandemic, and one of them describes this memory that he has of this one specific thing that his boyfriend Robert had done for him. And so when we take a look at that, it's really, really important that amongst all of these things in the final days of his life, we know that Clark is well into his 70s, that he is really looking at this in a way where, well, what's important to him and what is it that is really becoming clear to him in these final days. And therefore we can take a look at that and think as, well, what is it that Mandel celebrates and what is it that she endorses as being important in our lives and what is unimportant as well. I'm going to read this one outright. Number 4. There was a moment on Earth, improbable in retrospect, and actually briefer than a moment in the span of human history, more like the blink of an eye, when it was possible to make a living solely by photographing and interviewing famous people. For me, there's so much there that goes on, but it really is that direct way of saying to the reader, how about you contemplate what's important in your life? What does it mean that in a modern contemporary society that someone can make a living by interviewing a film star like Arthur Leander? Of course, this is a work of fiction, but we need to also consider the fact that this is going out to an audience in a modern society that need to consider their world and the way in which they use technology and the way in which they adore celebrities and so on. And so the fact that Mandel begins that chapter by saying there was a moment on Earth, it really takes us out of our own lives and gets us to consider what on earth we're going on about and what we're really doing. And so when we start to think about the rest of the events of the novel in that way, we can open ourselves to a bit of a judgment about how we organise ourselves and how we go about living our lives in the 21st century and what truly is important. This next quote is one that I love because it really breaks down the barriers between a professional and a personal life. And it happens on page 234. Something in him seemed to stutter, a breaking down of some mechanism. that had previously held his personal and professional lives apart. And so if you go on and you read that section on page 234, you'll know that that's about the newscaster that's looking down the camera, and he essentially says to his wife, take the kids to your parents' house. I'll try and meet you there. And he's essentially breaking that fourth wall that exists between he and the audience, because he's meant to just be speaking to the general public. And all of a sudden he just speaks directly to his wife. And so it's really indicative of this way in which people have been built up to show a professional side of things. You know, as a person who is a broadcaster must speak to all of the people that exist there in front of them. And they're not there to speak on television to this one person. But of course, this pandemic takes all of those layers away. And so therefore, it's an examination of what exists in the way that we project ourselves in how we look to be professional and who we truly are as people. Number 6 out of 10 when it comes to quotes that really mean more than what you might have thought. And this one happens on page 193. And it's at the point where Jeevan has started to take his first steps out into this post-pandemic world. And so you'll understand that he has been up in the apartment with Frank, and that they have run their course of all of the food and the water that they have. And tragically, Frank has made the decision that he cannot go out there into that world. And so Jeevan is going out there very much alone. When we have a think about what Mandel might be saying about technology, there is so much evidence to suggest that it is a return to what is normal and what is human and what is natural. So much of the natural world is described amongst the technological world, and it's this idea that the natural world has been inhibited by technology. And I love this quote on page 193 because it really gets to this idea of, well, what is Mandel really saying about it? Because as Jeevan goes out there into the world, he feels himself disappearing into the landscape. And so we start to think that, well, maybe this is his true self against nature. Maybe this is, the ridding of a society and all of these things that have burdened him. Mandel immediately follows that line, however, with the narration that he had never felt so alive or so sad. And so there are so many different ways that we can interpret that, but that idea that he'd never felt so alive really does lend itself to this idea that human beings are these natural creatures that have built all of these artificial things around them, and they've returned to them in the post-pandemic world. However, the fact that he felt so sad and that he's later described as feeling so unprotected suggests that perhaps that's not exactly what Mandel might be saying. And of course, it's up to you how you see that. And there's so much evidence that exists either way for the way that you might see what Mandel might be saying about the world in which human beings inhabit and how they go about being supported by that world and what they might be better off being without technological advances and all those other things that surround them. So a really, really good one for you to think about in terms of what Mandel might be saying about what this is all about. Number 7 on quotes that have a little more meaning than what you may have thought the first time you read them when it comes to Station 11. And we're now going to look at the pilot who flies out to Los Angeles a few days after the pandemic has begun. And he rounds up the people at Severn City Airport and he says, tomorrow I'm flying out to Los Angeles. And so what would have been routine in the days before, if we think about it, particularly in North America, which is one of the busiest corridors in the world when it comes to air travel, what would have been a routine action, a pilot just taking off from one coast of America and heading towards Los Angeles, has now become something of an ordeal in that he has warned people, this is where I'm going. There's the tragedy of the people who live in Asia in that they will be somewhat closer to their relatives, but there will still be an ocean between them. And so there is this really jarring feeling where Mandel mentions, this was an era where we paid extra for checking baggage. and where we saw flight and aviation as this thing and this facility that could get us to other places. And now, all of a sudden, within a few days, this had become something that felt very different and very different, that there was a free flight to Los Angeles in the way that it would go. And so there's so much more that is happening there where it happens. And I also want you to consider the fact that Mandel mentions the sound of the engines was startling after all these days of silence. And so in these early days of the post-pandemic world, and that technology is slowly coming to a halt, that the sound of the engines was so abrupt and that it was startling. And that's the actual quote. This idea that perhaps there was a natural world and that the technological world had taken over that for some time, and that it hadn't taken long for us to revert back to that natural world, and that we need to ask ourselves a lot of questions about something that had been a day-to-day, hour-to-hour occurrence, that planes would be in the sky. Yet all of a sudden, that was a very different prospect in this post-pandemic world. Number 8 is a quote from a section of the text that I think you should really spend some time looking at, because when we look at Station 11, there are all of the events that happen to our main characters and these major things that happen to them. Yet we need to always question, why on earth would Mandel mention these little things that happen with these small minor characters? And one of those characters is Dahlia. And if you're sitting there now thinking, who on earth is Dahlia? You need to take a look at this page on page 164, because Dahlia is one of the people that Clark interviews in one of his last 360-degree interviews about a CEO. And what she reveals to Clark actually reveals more to him about his own life than what it does about the target of the 360-degree report. And so Dahlia says a whole bunch of things, but one of them that she says is, that's what passes for a life. I should say that's what passes for happiness. For most people, guys like Dan, they're like sleepwalkers, she said, and nothing ever jolts them awake. And so there is this abrupt woman, Dahlia, who talks to Clark about how she doesn't believe in what she's doing, but she'll still provide comments about the CEO of her company. And she says about this guy, Dan, who we never know other than the idea of what Dahlia says about him, that he is this character who, feels he might be happy and all these types of things, but he's a sleepwalker. He's a joyless bastard is another quote that she uses. And so, again, like so many things that Mandel does, it's about this character that we never see, but we start to understand that all of these ideas about this character and what he might be about actually have an impact on others, such as Arthur, such as Clark. And Clark comes to this realization as well later that he has been sleepwalking, that he has been as, not present in his own life as what he would wish to be. And so there's so much that comes from that. And it's a really great one to think about, because it's this idea of taking some of the minor characters, and I can tell you now from marking thousands of essays when it comes to Station 11, that those who can go beyond the main characters and talk about these more minor events and how they relate to the main ideas are ones that can show that really deep knowledge. And so this idea that this leads Clark on a journey to realise that he has been, quote, minimally present in his own life is so telling and so much a part of what Mandel's main message of the text may really be. Number 9 comes to the word transcendence and comes from the quote on page 47, where they talk of transcendent beauty and joy. And so I really want you to consider that word transcend, because the word transcend means to go above, to move above, to move to something that is going above living, to be more than just surviving. And if we take the often used quote from Station 11, which is, survival is insufficient. We have that idea of survival being here and then enjoying our life being above it. And if survival is insufficient, well, then what exists above it? And so these moments of transcendent beauty and joy, there is that idea of going above, of being more than just a life and more than just surviving and more than just existing, but rather these moments that give us this beauty and this joy that actually makes life worth living. And finally, when it comes to quotes that you may have overlooked the first time, the very first time you picked up this book, you would have read this line, and it says, "The king stood in a pool of light, unmoored." That is the very opening sentence to this whole text. If we read a little bit further, we see that Kirsten on page 308, so at the complete other end of the novel, Mandel mentions that music had always unmoored her. And so if we think about that and what that might mean, there's so much that the fact that the novel really begins and ends with this idea of being unmoored. Do we need to find a perfect equal sign between Kirsten and Arthur? No, we don't. But can we find some connections there through that quote? Yeah, I think that we could. I think that there really is this idea where, to be moored to something means that you are tied to it. It's a shipping term. If you have a mooring out there in a bay, it means that you have a post that you can tie your boat or your vessel to. And so if you are unmoored, it means that you are untethered, that you are free. So there are all these distinctions that we could make about what it says about performing and the arts, and the fact that Arthur feels free on stage and free when he's doing these things in a way that Kirsten would as well. However, we could also bring it back to this idea of being completely out of control. And what could be interesting about that idea is that Kirsten could be someone who could be considered to not have control because of the consequences, because of the context of her life, this post-pandemic world with, profits and all these things happening within her existence. And yet, even in the pre-pandemic world, we have a character like Arthur who seemingly on the surface has all these things together, yet is still described as the king and being unmoored in his own life, in that he doesn't have control over his own happiness or his sense of destiny and purpose. There might be much more that you've got out of that and that I haven't seen, but I found it as a really, really interesting idea that very unique term, to be unmoored, was used between those two characters. So guys, that brings us to an end of the 10 quotes that you may not have thought much of the first time that you read them. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. As always, if you have any questions or comments, I will always get to them down there in the comments section there below the video. This is a video that is part of a series of our Understanding Station 11 from the English Lab. All of this content, along with a heck of a lot of other stuff, is all available to you in print form from our study guide, and I'll provide a link to that in the description for this video as well. But until we see you next time, all the best with your studies. Make sure you ask a lot of questions. Like the video if you've got something out of it. And until we see you next time, all the best.